and welcome back to my channel. So in this video, first of all, I'd just like to tie up the Packham documentary because the last video finished on me, and then I'll just go through some of your latest comments. I got up to the bit where he was talking about sensory issues, and I did feel they may be focused a little bit too much on sensory sensitivity or hypersensitivity, and not so much on hyposensitivity or undersensitivity. As Luke Bearden said, that autistics take in everything around them and can't block out stimuli, but he failed to mention that how actually it's a bit more nuanced than that, and obviously it depends on the autistic individual and like whether or not they're hypersensitive or hyposensitive, because some autistics are hypersensitive to some things and then undersensitive to other things, and you can be more or less hypersensitive or more or less undersensitive. So some autistics actually have the opposite problem, where they're not taking in everything in their environment, they're actually under-responsive to their environment. So they might have a profile where, I don't know, there's like a really noxious smell and they just can't smell it. So in that respect, they're not taking in their environment. So it does vary among autistic people. And the same person can be hypersensitive to some things and under-responsive to other things, and that can even vary. So they might be hypersensitive to smell one day and then under-responsive another day to the same sensory stimuli. So that nuance wasn't really covered in the programme, so it did come across as maybe a little bit simplistic there and might give some people the wrong impression. They didn't mention some of the under-recognised senses, such as, or rather the senses that aren't so often mentioned, such as proprioception. One of you asked what that is. It's a sense I only really became aware of recently in my readings. It's to do with the awareness of your body in space. I think it's to do with your receptors or something, your joints and things like that, and that send messages to the brain, and then your brain kind of uses that information to kind of judge where the body is in space and how to move through space without bumping into things and stuff like that. And autistics often have problems with that, I know I do. And vestibular, which is the balance sense. Say you might feel, which might make you feel car sick, like on a bus, or when I was a young kid, I used to absolutely hate going on coach rides on coaches. Like when we were on holiday, my dad used to have to phone up the coach company to tell them that I could only get on a certain type of coach, which had air conditioning and lots of air movement, because otherwise I refused to get on the coach, and I would basically get really upset. Looking back on it, that clearly was a sensory issue, although obviously we didn't know about that stuff back then. But yeah, vestibular as well I'm not good in cars, and I don't like movement like on boats and things like that, or like escalators or lifts. So that's all kind of like vestibular kind of balance type sense, which is often a little bit off in autistic people, and that was something I didn't mention. The other thing I also wanted to say was in reference to Chris Packham needing all of his shirts to be in perfect order. I'm actually the opposite. I can't remember if I mentioned this in a previous video, but I'm the opposite. My clothes are just dumped all over the place. And that's because, although like Packham, I have exactly the same need for order and symmetry and things being all perfect and all of that. I have exactly the same need, but I also have really bad executive functioning problems and a lot of problem with organising things and keeping things organised and processing like what's in my environment and how to organise it and things like that. And that's really common in autism, but that wasn't talked about in the programme. In actual fact, executive functioning problems are hardly ever talked about in these programmes, which again can unfortunately bolster the stereotype that some people have that autistics are all really neat and organised and everything. When I was a teenager, I was the complete antithesis of that. Funnily enough, my brother was the really, really organised, neat one. He's definitely broader phenotype, by the way. He's not autistic though, but he definitely has traits. Some of them actually quite stereotypical, even though he's not autistic. Whereas for me, I was actually the complete opposite. My bedroom was really quite chaotic, things just dumped all over the place. And that's not because I like it that way, it's because I really struggle with organisation. So for me, my clothes are just dumped all over higgledy-piggledy. I don't have any of that kind of stuff that Chris Packham was talking about, of them all being And yet, I do still have this really strong need for order, and I will try and impose order in my environment, and I do the whole kind of like lining up thing and pattern thing they talked about. That's always been a big part of my life. Like when I was a child, I did it with dolls. I did it, so I've always had this need to kind of like line things up and order things. It's just that I also have really bad executive functioning, so it's kind of like order but also extreme disorder in the same person, which is can sound a little bit contradictory. But yeah. Anyway, I now want to get onto your comments. So I won't be able to get through all of your comments, just some of them, and I'll try and get onto the other ones another time. So the first comment says that you heavily identify with that messing up of perfection. You bought a bunch of painting supplies last year to teach yourself how to paint, and after 2 tries you can't bring yourself to ruin any more of the pristine white paper. And this month you got a brand new journal with cover art that you really like, but you can't bring yourself to write in it. As removing the packaging from anything is a huge stressor for you. You say that you have ASD, but you don't have OCD, you just have autism. So yeah, that's really interesting, and that is exactly the same as what I experience. That's really quite interesting that we both have that. So I definitely think it's definitely part of the autism. Clearly, obviously for me, I do also have OCD as part of my profile, so that might make some of this obviously more intense in a way, because the OCD kind of feeds into it as well. But I think that it is clearly part of the autism, this need for perfection, and it comes back to that kind of like extreme order thing, a bit like Packham was talking about in a programme where he has got all of his books out in one of the rooms because he's recently moved house, and he still hasn't managed to put all his books back because it's like the whole kind of like stress or kind of ensuring they're in the right order and stuff. I think that kind of comes from the same thing, the same place. There's so much choice involved, and it's like breaking that perfection, and I'm exactly the same as you in that respect. I really have to force myself how to use things. I have to use things in a particular order. Opening anything that's brand new always causes anxiety because there's so much choice involved, like how am I going to use it, what if it goes wrong, it looks so perfect, now I've spoilt it, wanting everything to remain perfect and in its kind of the state it originally was in, that sort of pristine state. So 100%, that is very much part of my life. It was actually mentioned in my diagnosis when I got diagnosed. The psychiatrist actually wrote in my autism report, the final report that was done confirming my diagnosis, that this was part of the autism as well, like the difficulties I've had since I was a child of like opening presents and sort of like messing things up essentially. So yeah, it's definitely part of the autism, and that's interesting that you have that trait as well. Let me know if any other of you watching this also have that trait. So another one of you says, and this is from someone who's not autistic but has both OCD and ADHD, that you say that you're very routine based, although not to the extent of yourself or the individual in the programme. For you, you think that quite a lot of just right OCD is involved. You find that your routines help compensate for ADHD, as things that are part of your routine you remember to do, but anything that falls outside of your routine gets forgotten. So that's interesting. I think, funny enough, the autism routine for me also helps some of my executive dysfunctioning. For example, I will never ever forget to turn the oven off, for example, because part of my OCD rituals is to always check the oven is off several times before I go to bed. So that's part of OCD. Although having said that, there is overlap with autism as well, because it's kind of like a sort of reassure is part of my routine. It's like a ritual I have to do. So it's part OCD but also part of the autism. It doesn't really cause me distress or anything, which is why I sometimes wonder whether it's more part of the autism, because in classic OCD it causes the person distress. but it doesn't cause me distress. It's just something I have to do, and I don't do it as much as some people with OCD. Like, I'll only check it like about 2 or 3 times, but I have to do it in a particular way, and I have to do that just to reassure myself everything is off. But that compensates, I guess, against some of the executive dysfunctioning, because in other areas, like, I will forget things or won't do things properly, but the OCD at least ensures the oven is always off before I go to bed and stuff like that. Which you could say is kind of quite useful in a way, although maybe I don't need to check quite as much as what I do, obviously. So yeah, that was interesting, how they can work together in a way. So I'm going to move over to video number 2 now, because I just want to carry on going over some of your comments. So moving over to video number 2 now.